Vernon Rusk didn't bother lowering his voice when he tore the notice from the post and read it aloud in the middle of Cedar Hollow's Main Street, loud enough for the mercantile clerk to hear, loud enough for the widow Hennessy to stop sweeping her porch, loud enough for every man and boy within 30 yards to turn and stare. Elias Sutter, he read, drawing each syllable out slow and deliberate, like a man savoring a piece of meat, is hereby declared a thief, a fraud, and a debtor of the first order. He folded the paper with one hand, tucked it into his coat pocket, and smiled at the small crowd beginning to form. And his daughter, he paused, let his eyes drift toward the window of the land office across the street where Maribel Sutter stood watching. Her face pale as February snow will answer for what he left behind. Nobody said a word. That was the thing about Cedar Hollow in the winter of 1887. Nobody ever said a word. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you are exactly who this channel was made for. Hit subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a single story, because the next one is already waiting. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's find out what happens when the most dangerous man in the territory meets the one woman he cannot break. The livestock hall on the eastern edge of Cedar Hollow had been built to hold cattle auctions, and it still smelled like one. Hay dust and animal sweat, and the sharp bite of cold air leaking through the gaps in the plank walls. But on this particular Thursday morning in January, the stalls were empty of livestock and full of people, ranchers in worn coats, shopkeepers who had locked their doors to come watch. 3 men who worked for the bank standing near the back with their arms crossed. A handful of women who had come because they could not stay away, even though most of them would not meet Maribel Sutter's eyes when she walked in. She walked in alone. She was 28 years old, tall for a woman, with dark hair she'd pinned back tight against her neck the way she always did when she needed to look like she wasn't afraid. Her father's coat, too large across the shoulders, the hem worn at the cuffs, was the warmest thing she owned. She carried a leather satchel under one arm, with the documents she'd spent 3 weeks gathering. Proof of payment, letters of intent, a surveyor's estimate her father had filed 2 years ago with the territorial office. None of it was going to matter. She knew that walking in. But she had come anyway, because Elias Sutter had raised her to stand in the room, even when standing in the room changed nothing. Vernon Rusk was already at the front table when she entered. He was 53 years old and built like something that had been compressed over decades into a denser, harder version of itself. Not fat, not soft, just solid in the way that old wood gets solid when it's dried past the point of bending. He wore a good suit, which was always a little wrong for Cedar Hollow, like he was reminding everyone that he belonged somewhere else, and chose to be here because it suited him. His hair was iron gray and combed flat. His eyes were the color of water in winter, pale and still and completely without warmth. Beside him sat Harlan Peck, the county sheriff, a man who had been hired by Rusk's money and kept by Rusk's patience, and who had not made an independent decision in 4 years. Beside Peck sat a man Maribel didn't recognize, young, narrow-faced, with the careful hands of a lawyer. She found a seat in the second row. A woman she'd known since childhood, Dory Albrecht, whose husband had bought grain from her father for 15 years, shifted 2 inches away from her. Maribel put her satchel on her knees and stared at the front of the room. Rusk didn't look at her yet. He was speaking to Peck in a low voice, and Peck was nodding at regular intervals, and the lawyer was making small marks on a document with a pen. There was something in the practiced ease of it that made Maribel's stomach tighten. This had been arranged before she arrived, probably before she'd even been notified of the hearing. The clerk, a young man named Tolliver, who had a nervous habit of pulling at his collar, called the room to order with considerably less authority than the situation required. "We're here to settle the matter of outstanding debts against the estate of the late Elias Sutter," he announced, reading from a paper he clearly hadn't written, including notes held by the Consolidated Territorial Bank and 2 private lien holders. He swallowed. As well as to determine the disposition of the property commonly known as the Sutter Upper Parcel, located 1,200 acres along the northern ridge, Rusk said, without raising his hand or standing up, just correcting the record for efficiency. Tolliver found his place again. Along the northern ridge above Cedar Hollow, currently in disputed ownership. Not disputed, the narrow-faced lawyer said pleasantly. In arrears. Maribel opened her satchel and took out the first document. The hearing proceeded the way these things proceed, when one side has a lawyer and a sheriff and the other side has 3 weeks of late-night paperwork. The debt figures were read aloud. They were large. Larger than she had prepared for, and she had prepared to be surprised. Her father had borrowed against the property. That much was true. She had known that since the summer. What she had not known, what became clear in the first 10 minutes of the hearing, was that the interest had been compounding at a rate she could not find in any document she had signed or her father had signed. When she said so out loud, the narrow-faced lawyer smiled at her with great patience and produced a page she had never seen before, with her father's signature at the bottom. "This is not his signature," she said. "Ma'am, I have 40 letters my father wrote to me over the course of 12 years. I know his signature. This is not it." Sheriff Peck cleared his throat. "Miss Sutter, I understand this is difficult. I'm asking a factual question about a document, Sheriff. That is not the same as being difficult." Peck looked at Rusk. Rusk had still not looked at Maribel. The hearing continued. By the time it reached the section about the property transfer, Maribel had submitted 4 of her documents and had each one acknowledged, set aside, and effectively ignored. The surveyor's estimate was described as informal. The letter of intent from her father's partner, a man named Aldine, who had since moved to Oregon, was described as unverified. The payment receipt she'd found in her father's strongbox, a receipt showing the first 3 notes had been paid in full in October of 1885, was examined by the lawyer for 2 full minutes before he set it down and said, "The provenance of this document is unclear." "The provenance," Maribel said, keeping her voice level with considerable effort, "is that I found it in my father's strongbox in our house, with his other papers, which is where receipts are kept." "Miss Sutter." The lawyer folded his hands. "Your father is deceased. We have no way to verify. Then call the bank teller who processed the payment. His name is on the stamp." A silence. "Mr. Greer," the lawyer said, without looking up, "has relocated." "When?" Pause. "Recently." She looked at him for a long moment. "How convenient." Rusk finally looked at her. It was not an aggressive look. That was almost the worst part of it. It was the look of a man watching a process unfold according to plan, the way you'd watch a clock tick toward the hour. Patient. Almost bored. He had done this before, or something like it, and it had ended the same way each time, and he expected this to end the same way too. Maribel held his gaze. She didn't look away. It took something out of her to do it, but she did it. Then the front doors of the livestock hall opened. The cold came in first. A wave of it, sharp enough that several people near the back turned around. And behind the cold, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe, because the doorframe was built for ordinary men and he was not an ordinary man, came Bram Veylor. Maribel had heard the name. Everyone in the valley had heard the name. A mountain man who lived somewhere past the northern peaks, who came down to Cedar Hollow maybe twice a year for supplies, and otherwise wanted nothing from anyone. The stories about him varied depending on who was telling them. Some said he had killed a man in a mining dispute years back. Some said he had survived a winter alone that would have finished anyone else. Some said he was simply broken, that whatever had happened to him 6 years ago when he left civilization had taken the reasonable part of him with it. What she saw was a man who was perhaps 35, enormously tall and broad across the chest, with a dark beard gone long and tangled, and a scar that ran from his left cheekbone down toward his jaw on the same side. His coat was elk hide, and it was old. His boots were the kind that had been repaired so many times they were more repair than original. He moved without any hesitation, which was the thing that struck her first most men who walked into a room like this, with 50 people already seated, and Vernon Rusk already at the front table, moved with at least some degree of caution. Bram Veylor walked like a man crossing his own kitchen. He came down the center aisle without looking at anyone in particular. People moved out of his way without being asked. He stopped at the front table where the debt documents were laid out, and he set down a leather pouch that landed with the dense, particular sound of a pouch full of gold coin. The room went very quiet. Rusk stared at the pouch. "What?" Rusk said slowly. "Do you think you are doing?" Bram reached into the pouch and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and set it flat on the table, a number, written in clear figures with a line below it. He tapped the number with one finger. "That's the total," he said. His voice was low and rougher than expected, like a tool that hadn't been used often enough. Notes, interest, everything Tolliver read out. "I'm paying it." The lawyer started to say something. Rusk put one hand up without looking at him, and the lawyer stopped. That property, Rusk said quietly, is already spoken for. Debt's not paid yet. It will be. Wasn't this morning. Bram looked at Tolliver. Is there a procedural objection to a third party settling the debt before the property changes hands? Tolliver looked at Rusk, looked at the lawyer, looked at his papers with the expression of a man wishing he had stayed in bed. I technically, prior to formal. Then we don't have a problem, Bram said. We have a very significant problem, Rusk said. His voice was still quiet, but something in it had changed. A temperature. You're coming into my county, into my proceedings, and you're interfering with a legal debt collection. I want to know why. Bram turned and looked directly at Maribel for the first time. She had been watching him since he walked in, and she'd been trying to figure out what she was looking at: threat, spectacle, or something she didn't have a category for yet. When his eyes found hers, she noticed they were dark brown and not unintelligent, which surprised her, and that the look he gave her was not the look of a man assessing property. It was something else, harder to name. He turned back to Rusk. I'll take her, he said. The room erupted. Not loud Cedar Hollow people were not loud, but everyone started talking at once in the particular compressed way of people who cannot believe what they have just heard. Dory Albrecht pressed her hand to her mouth. 3 of the men near the back shifted their weight and looked at each other. Sheriff Peck put his hand on the table and then appeared to decide not to stand up. Maribel stood up. I beg your pardon, she said, with a precision that cut through the noise. Bram looked at her again, and then he did something that made even less sense than the gold. You can say no, he said. I'm not Rusk. The comparison landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Rusk's jaw tightened. Several people near him found somewhere else to look. Maribel stared at Bram Veylor. He was waiting. Not expectantly, not impatiently, just waiting, the way a man waits who has decided what he will do, and is prepared for it to go either way. She looked at Vernon Rusk, who had already turned back to the table with the expression of a man recalculating. She looked at the documents in her satchel documents that had been dismissed and set aside and explained away by a lawyer whose name she didn't know, who worked for a man who had destroyed her father. She looked at the door. I'll get my coat, she said. They didn't speak for the first 2 hours after leaving Cedar Hollow. That was mostly because the trail Bram took heading north didn't allow for speech. It required concentration, single-file movement, and occasionally both hands on the horse's neck to keep from sliding on the ice. But when they reached a widening in the trail where a dead pine had fallen and created a natural windbreak, Bram stopped and dismounted without explanation and began checking his horse's left foreleg with careful, practiced hands. Maribel dismounted and stood a few feet away. What exactly did you just buy? She said. He didn't look up from the horse's leg. Nothing. You paid my debts. I paid debts. Didn't purchase anything. You said you'd take me. He straightened and looked at her directly, and she noticed again that he did not flinch from eye contact, which was unusual in a man who apparently lived alone by choice. I said that so Rusk would understand the transaction. He only understands property. He paused. You're not property. Then what am I? Woman in a bad position, he said, matter-of-factly, and went back to examining the horse. Same as you were before I walked in, except now the debt's clear. That doesn't explain why. He was quiet for a moment. Your father's name is Elias Sutter. Was a pause. Was, yes, he stood up, I knew him. She was cold by the time they reached the first river crossing.
Cold in the bone-deep way that stops feeling like temperature
and starts feeling like a state of being. The river was not frozen solid. There was a channel of moving water in the center, dark and fast and deeply unpleasant, and Bram crossed it first with his horse, then came back for hers, walking the animal through with one hand on the bridle and one hand holding a rope he'd attached to the saddle horn. He didn't offer to carry her. He told her to keep her weight forward and her feet out of the stirrups in case the horse stumbled, and she did exactly that, and she was grateful for instructions she could follow instead of help she hadn't asked for. On the far bank, he handed her a strip of dried meat from his coat pocket without comment. She ate it. It was tough and oversalted, and she'd never been so grateful for food in her life. How did you know my father? She asked. We worked together. Survey work 8 years back. He checked the rope and began coiling it. He was a good surveyor, careful. Wrote everything down twice. He did, she said. Something in her chest moved. She didn't let it show. Did you know he was in debt? Knew about the notes later. Knew who held them. Rusk. Rusk bought them from the original lender 2 years ago. Paid less than face value for them, then raised the rate. She stared at him. That's illegal. A lot of things Rusk does are illegal, Bram said. Hard to prosecute a man who owns the sheriff. What do you know about the upper parcel? He tied off the rope and looked at her for a moment. Let's make it another 3 miles before dark, he said. Then we can talk. The talk didn't happen that night because by the time they made camp, a shallow overhang of rock above a creek bed, out of the wind, barely Maribel had burned through whatever had been keeping her upright since the livestock haul and was running on empty. She ate what Bram cooked without tasting it and fell asleep sitting against the rock wall before she'd finished the cup of coffee he'd handed her, which embarrassed her when she thought about it later, though by then she had stopped tracking the embarrassments because there were too many of them. She woke once in the night when a sound she couldn't identify made her sit up fast, hand going toward the knife he'd started keeping at her belt since her father died. Bram was sitting on the far side of the overhang's entrance, his back against the rock, watching the dark. He had given her the bedroll. He had the blanket he'd tied behind his saddle. Wolf, he said before she could ask. Far enough. Go back to sleep. She did not go back to sleep immediately. She lay there listening to the dark and the creek and the very distant sound of an animal moving through the timber, and she thought about Vernon Rusk's face when she'd stood up and told him she was getting her coat, and about her father's signature on a document she'd never seen before, and about the way Bram Veylor had set that pouch of gold on the table like it was nothing, like he'd been carrying it around, waiting for exactly this moment. She thought about what he'd said. Your father's name is Elias Sutter. Past tense. Already corrected. The way someone talks about a person they knew and respected and are still sorting out the loss of. She pulled the blanket tighter and stared at the overhang's ceiling. What do you know about the upper parcel? He'd deflected, which meant he knew something, which meant this was not simple charity, and she'd known that from the moment the gold hit the table, but knowing it and having to think about what it meant were different things. She was still thinking about it when she fell back asleep. The next morning he woke her before dawn and had coffee ready, and the horses fed, which meant he'd been up for at least an hour before her. She didn't thank him because she had the feeling he would find it awkward. She drank the coffee and stamped her feet against the cold and looked at the sky, which was heavy and gray and considering snow. We have a problem, she said. One in particular? I left Cedar Hollow with a man I don't know, in the middle of winter, to go somewhere I've never been, without telling anyone where I was going. She looked at him. I also have no money, no change of clothing, and approximately 3 days of pride left before I have to admit I have no idea what I'm doing. He looked at her with an expression that might have been the beginning of something, not a smile. He didn't quite get there, but the suggestion that a smile was a thing he was distantly familiar with. You know what you're doing, he said. I knew what I was doing this morning when I was still asleep. You got yourself out of a room that was going to cost you everything. That's what you were doing. She considered that. What do you know about the upper parcel? She asked again. This time he answered. He answered walking, which she appreciated, because it meant she had to focus on the trail and couldn't look at his face, which made the information come easier for both of them. He talked about the survey work his and her father's 8 years back along the northern ridge, the rock formations, the particular color change in the stone that her father had noticed first and flagged on the map, and then quietly, methodically, over 2 seasons, tested. Silver, she said. A lot of it, Bram said, not on the surface. Beneath. Requires some engineering to get at it, but it's there. She walked for several steps in silence. My father knew. Your father found it. And Rusk has known for at least 3 years. Someone talked. I don't know who. His voice was flat when he said it, but something tightened in his jaw. After that, it was just a matter of getting your father out of the way. She stopped walking. He went 2 steps further before he realized she'd stopped and turned. Getting him out of the way, she said. Yes, you mean. I mean, Rusk arranged the debt to force a sale, and when your father wouldn't sell, he stopped. She looked at him. Her father had died in September, thrown from a horse on a trail he'd ridden for 20 years. The horse had come home without him. They'd found him the next morning at the base of a ravine. The horse, she said. Bram said nothing. The horse was calm, she said, when it came home. It wasn't wild-eyed. It wasn't cut a horse that's been spooked enough to throw a rider that trail has runs and cuts on it. There's fencing along that. She stopped, pressed her mouth together, looked away at the tree line. I noticed at the time. I told myself I was looking for something that wasn't there. Bram was quiet for a moment. I think you were looking for exactly what was there, he said, carefully. And I think you were right. She breathed through her nose for a long count, slow and deliberate and private. You have the survey record, she said. Not a question. Hidden. At the lodge. And they established that the mineral claim belongs to the Sutter property. To me, to you. She turned back and looked at him. Something had shifted in her face. Not grief, not anymore, or not only that. Something that was starting to look, very slightly, like calculation. Then we have a problem that's more complicated than Rusk buying notes, she said. We have a man who committed fraud and very probably murder, and who will not stop until he has that property. Yes, Bram said. And you walked into that livestock hall knowing all of this. Yes. Why didn't you go to the territorial authorities? Tried, 2 years ago. The man I spoke to in Helena, he paused. He filed the report. 3 weeks later, Rusk's lawyer sent me a letter informing me that an inquiry had been conducted, and the matter was closed. He said it without bitterness, which made it worse, somehow like a man reporting the weather. Rusk has reached into Helena. Not deep, but enough. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking again. He fell in beside her. So you paid the debt, she said. You removed the immediate legal mechanism. And you brought me up the mountain. She thought for a moment. And you have the survey records. And you have your father's papers. Whatever you managed to keep before the hearing. She glanced at the satchel she was still carrying across her back. His financial records. Some correspondence. The payment receipt they dismissed. Is there anything else? Letters, notes. Anything he might have written that referenced the deposit or the survey or Rusk by name. She thought about the strongbox. About what she'd taken and what she'd left behind, working fast in the hour before the hearing, while she tried to figure out what would matter. There might be a ledger, she said slowly. He kept a second one. Separate from the business books. I always thought it was for personal expenses. He was careful about money in a way that drove me mad sometimes, but I didn't look closely. I grabbed it without looking at it. She unslung the satchel and opened it and dug past the documents to the bottom, where she'd shoved a small battered notebook with a water-damaged cover. She'd assumed it was the expense record. That was what she'd thought when she picked it up in the 10 minutes she'd had before she had to leave the house. She opened it now and read the first page. Then she stopped walking. What? Bram said. She turned the book so he could see. The page was dense with figures and names and dates, but also with marginal notes in her father's small, precise hand notes that were not about expenses at all. Notes about payments made by Rusk to specific people. Dates, amounts, names she recognized, Peck's name. A man on the territorial committee. 2 others she didn't know, but that Bram apparently did, because when he read the page, his face did something complicated. That's not an expense ledger, he said. No, she agreed. That's a record he kept deliberately, in case something happened to him. She looked at the book in her hands. Her father's handwriting. 2 years of careful, secretive documentation, kept by a man who had known he was in danger and had written it all down anyway. Because Elias Sutter wrote everything down twice and could not stop himself from trying to build a record, even when the record might never matter. He was trying to protect me, she said. Bram looked at the book for a moment. Then he looked at her. I think, he said quietly, he was trying to protect everyone Rusk was going to come after next. She closed the book and held it against her chest, and for one long moment, just one, standing in the middle of a frozen trail on the side of a mountain in January, she let herself understand what her father had done and why, and what it had cost him. Then she put the book back in the satchel and fastened the clasp. How much further to your lodge? She said. Tomorrow afternoon, he said, if the weather holds. She looked at the sky. The clouds were lower than they'd been an hour ago. And if it doesn't, we find shelter and wait it out. She squared her shoulders. Then let's move. The weather did not hold. By mid-afternoon, the snow was coming sideways off the ridge above them, and the trail had narrowed to something Maribel was no longer certain was a trail at all, or just a gap between trees that Bram was navigating from memory. She couldn't feel her left hand, despite the glove, which she didn't mention, because mentioning it would accomplish nothing. She focused on the back of Bram's horse and kept moving. Then her horse missed a step on a patch of ice beneath the snow, lurched sideways, and nearly went over the edge of what turned out to be a drop of about 15 feet to a frozen creek bed below. She stayed in the saddle. Barely. By some combination of instinct and the fact that she grabbed the horse's mane with both hands and threw her weight the other direction before she'd fully processed what was happening. When the horse steadied, she realized she was shaking. Bram had turned the moment he heard the scramble of hooves and was beside her in seconds, taking the bridle, talking to the horse in a low, steady voice that did something remarkable to the animal. Calmed it almost immediately, like the voice was something it recognized as safe. "You all right?" he said, looking at her. "Yes," she said, which was approximately true. He didn't push it. He didn't say that was close, or you should have told me you were struggling. He just held the bridle for another moment until both horse and rider were steady, and then he looked at the sky and made a decision she could see happening in real time in the set of his jaw. "There's a trapper's shelter another half-mile east," he said. "We're going there. The lodge can wait. You can't feel your left hand." She looked at her hand. "I didn't say that. You haven't used it in 40 minutes. She looked up at him. He had been watching her for 40 minutes, apparently, while navigating a mountain trail in a blizzard without appearing to watch anyone. "Half a mile east," she said. "Yes." "Then let's go." The trapper's shelter was small and had clearly not been used in more than a season, but the roof held, and there was a wood pile under a lean-to on the east side that was mostly dry. And within an hour, Bram had a fire going, and the horses sheltered in snow melting over the heat in a tin pan for water. Maribel sat near the fire and worked her left hand open and closed until the feeling came back, which was unpleasant in the specific way that returning circulation always is pins and needles, and then an ache. And then she took the ledger out of her satchel and spread it open on her knee and began reading it from the beginning. She read for a long time. Bram moved around the small space doing the practical things that needed doing, and he left her alone, which she was grateful for. By the time she'd finished, the fire had burned down to coals that needed tending, and the wind outside had reached a pitch that made the shelter's walls creak. "My father knew for at least 2 years," she said. "He documented everything. The bribery, the land seizures. There are 3 other families mentioned here, Bram. 3 other properties Rusk took the same way he tried to take ours." Bram added wood to the fire. "He didn't go to anyone?" she asked. Maybe he didn't trust anyone to go to. He sat back on his heels. Or maybe he was building the case before he moved. Some men do that wait until they have everything, because they know one shot is all they get. "He ran out of time," she said. "Yes." She looked at the ledger. "This, combined with the survey records you have, is enough to take to the territorial court, possibly enough to interest the federal land office." He looked at her steadily. "If we can get it there without Rusk's people getting to it first. Or us. She closed the ledger. Outside, the blizzard continued its conversation with the mountain, loud and indifferent. "He's going to come for us," she said. "Yes. He'll know by now. Somyon at the hearing will have told him which direction we rode. He'll know. He won't move until the weather breaks, because he doesn't know this country well enough to move in a storm. But after," Bram nodded, "he'll send men." Maribel looked at the fire. "Then we need to be ready," she said, "before they arrive." Bram looked at her for a moment with that expression she was starting to recognize. Not quite surprised, but close to it, like a man recalibrating a calculation. "Yes," he said. "We do." She held out the ledger. "Then you should read this," she said, "because you're going to need to know what we're dealing with." He took it from her with both hands, carefully, the way you'd take something that mattered. "Your father," he said after a moment, not quite looking up, "was a braver man than most." She looked at the fire. "I know," she said. "I just wish he'd told me." He read the ledger the way her father must have written it, slow and methodical, going back to certain pages twice, sometimes 3 times. Maribel watched him without appearing to watch him, which was a skill she had developed over years of living with a father who didn't like being observed when he was thinking. Bram's face gave almost nothing away, but the pauses told her things. He stopped longest on the page that listed the Garfield family. She didn't know that name, and again on a section near the back that was written in a tighter hand than the rest, like her father had been cramped for space or time. When he finished, he set the ledger on his knee and looked at the fire for a while. 3 families, Maribel said. 4, there's one at the back, the Garfields, that your father only partially documented. I think he ran out of time before he could finish it. She hadn't caught that. She looked at the cover of the ledger. Do you know them? Knew of them. They had a parcel south of the ridge, good water rights. Sold out in '85 under conditions I always thought were strange. He turned one of the later pages. This explains the conditions. Rusk forced the debt the same way. Same mechanism, yes. Different leverage. He closed the ledger. The Garfield boy, he'd had some trouble. Legal trouble, the kind that goes away if the right people want it to go away. Or gets worse if they don't. Maribel looked at the fire. Rusk threatened the sun. That's what this reads like. My father knew about it and documented it. Your father, Bram said, was building a case that would have brought down half the county's leadership structure. He just needed time he didn't get. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm had settled into a steadier, rhythmless, violent but more committed, the kind that means business. The survey records, she said, at the lodge. What exactly do they show? He set the ledger aside and stretched his legs toward the fire, and she noticed for the first time that his right knee didn't move quite right, a stiffness that he compensated for naturally, automatically, the way an old injury becomes part of how a person moves without them noticing anymore. They show the mineral survey your father and I conducted along the northern ridge in 1879 and again in 1881, he said. They show the sample tests, the depth calculations, the estimated yield. And they show the claim registration your father filed with the Territorial Land Office in November of 1881 under his own name, which makes me the legal heir to the claim. If we can produce the original documentation. The filing itself exists in Helena, or it should. But Rusk has been in Helena, and territorial records have a way of going missing when someone with money and patience wants them to. You think he had the filing removed? I think he tried. I think your father anticipated that and kept copies. He looked at her. He gave me the copies. For safekeeping, he said. Bram stopped for a moment. He said he didn't want them in his house because he was worried about what might happen if things went wrong. The fire popped. Maribel didn't move. He knew, she said. He knew something was coming. He didn't know exactly what, but he gave you the copies. He trusted you with them. We worked together for 2 seasons, Bram said. A man gets to know another man, working conditions like that. And he never told me. She said it without accusation, but it sat in the air between them. Not the silver, not the survey, not any of it. Bram was quiet for a moment. He told me you were studying to be a teacher, he said. That you'd been accepted to a school in Billings, and that he was paying for it. She closed her eyes briefly. He saved for 3 years for that. He didn't want the mine business touching you until he had it settled. He thought he had more time. Bram turned to look at her directly. It wasn't a judgment about what you could handle. He was protective in the specific way of a man who has seen what happens when the wrong person figures out who matters to you. She sat with that for a while. The fire was warm on her face, and cold was coming through the shelter wall at her back, and she thought about her father sitting at his kitchen table at night, writing in that ledger with his small, careful hand, knowing exactly what he was documenting and why, knowing that if she found it, it meant something had happened to him. He left me a map, she said finally. He just didn't tell me it was a map. Bram said nothing, which was the right response. She reached out and picked up the ledger and put it back in her satchel. We need to move at first light, she said. Whatever Rusk knows or doesn't know about where we went, we've been stationary too long. Storm will be lighter by morning. Then we go at first light. He nodded. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and leaned against the wall at an angle where she could see both the fire and the door without moving her head. Bram. He looked at her. Why did you stay on the mountain? She asked. 6 years. After the survey work, after you knew about the deposit, why not leave? Why stay up here? The question surprised him. She could see that. Or maybe not the question itself, but the directness of it. After 2 days of her, asking only what she needed to know. He looked at the fire for a moment. I had something to stay for, he said. And then I didn't. And by the time I thought about leaving, I'd been here long enough that leaving seemed... He stopped. Started differently. Town didn't suit me anymore. If it ever did. She didn't push it. She could hear in the pause before his answer that there was more there. A whole geography of something that had happened. But she wasn't going to reach for it tonight. Get some sleep, he said. I'll keep watch. You kept watch last night. I sleep light. It doesn't cost me much. She looked at him for another moment. Thank you, she said, for the bedroll. It's the only one I have. That's why I'm thanking you for it. He looked away and made a sound that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite deflection. She decided it was the closest thing to your welcome that he knew how to produce, and let it be enough. She closed her eyes. Sleep took a long time to come. The second day on the trail was harder than the first, which she hadn't thought possible, And what made it harder wasn't the cold or the terrain, but the silence that had a different quality to it now. They had talked in the shelter, and now they both knew more about each other than strangers should after 3 days. And that knowledge sat between them like something that needed time to settle. She rode and thought and watched the mountain and tried not to think about Cedar Hollow and whether anyone there was already talking to Rusk's people. They were. She knew they were. She'd seen it in Dory Albrecht's face at the hearing, not malice, just the calculation of a woman who understands which way the wind is blowing and adjusts accordingly. Dory would not have volunteered information, but if someone asked her directly which direction Maribel Sutter had ridden with the mountain man, Dory would have told them, because that's what people do when the alternative is becoming the next one in front of the debt table. Around midday, they crossed a second river, this one shallower and slower than the first, and on the far bank, Bram pointed north to where the ridge broke and showed a cut in the rock that from a distance looked like just another shadow. "We go through there," he said. "Other side is my country." "Your country," she said. "My territory. The land I know." He said it without arrogance. It was just a statement of fact, the way a man describes his kitchen. Past that cut, Rusk's men would be working from guesswork. There aren't good maps of this area. The ones that exist are wrong in 3 or 4 important ways. "Because you made sure of it?" He glanced at her sideways. Territorial surveys of this region," he said carefully, "contain some significant errors. Errors that you introduced. Errors that I declined to correct." She looked at the cut in the ridge. "That's actually quite clever. It kept people away," he said, and nudged his horse forward, and she followed him through the cut in the rock and out the other side into a different country, wilder, the timber old growth, and the air somehow colder and sharper, like even the weather here ran on different rules. By mid-afternoon, she had stopped shivering. Not because she'd warmed up, she hadn't, but because her body had apparently run out of energy to shiver with and was conserving everything else for the work of staying upright. Bram noticed. She wasn't sure how, because she was certain she hadn't made a visible sign, but he pulled up and looked at her, and then without comment reached into his saddlebag and produced a second coat heavier than hers, lined with something she couldn't identify, and smelling powerfully of wood smoke and cedar. "It's too big," she said. "Put it on," he said. She put it on. It was dramatically too big, hanging past her hips and swallowing her hands, and she had to fold the cuffs back twice to find her fingers. She did not care even slightly. The warmth was immediate and so profound that she had to breathe through it for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "You were about to lose feeling in your feet," he said. "I was managing." "You were managing in the direction of frostbite." He turned his horse north again. "It's not far now." It was another hour and a half, which she did not consider close, but she kept that opinion to herself because the coat had shifted the arithmetic considerably, and she was capable of another hour and a half. The lodge appeared between 2 stands of old pine and was not at all what she had imagined. She had imagined a trapper's cabin roof logs, small windows, the minimum structure that stands between a man and the elements. What she found was something larger and more deliberate, a building that had been added to over time with care. Each addition fitted to the last, with a mason's attention to level and plumb. There was a covered porch on the south side, and a barn structure off to the east, and what appeared to be a root cellar built into the hillside behind it with a good heavy door. She looked at the lodge for a moment. "You built this," she said. "Mostly, over 6 years. Had time," he said, dismounting. "You had more than time," she said, looking at the south porch with its fitted joints. "You had a plan." He didn't answer that. He took his horse toward the barn, and she followed with hers, and she thought about what kind of man builds a structure like this, alone in the mountains, and whether the building was something he'd done because he expected to live here permanently, or because he needed something to do with his hands while he waited for something else to resolve. The barn was warm, 3 horses already inside, 2 of them mares she didn't know, one a big dark gelding that lifted its head and then went back to its hay with the disinterest of an animal with no anxieties. Bram moved through the space with the efficiency of a man who has done the same tasks in the same order so many times they require no thought, and Maribel took care of her own horse, which she was capable of doing and preferred to do, and when they were done, she followed him to the lodge. Inside, it was warmer than she expected. He must have banked a fire before he left for Cedar Hollow, she realized, which meant he had planned this, at least to the degree of intending to return with someone who would need warmth. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked around. The books were the first thing that registered. Shelves on 3 walls, floor to ceiling, on 2 of them, packed with volumes. She could see from where she stood that they covered engineering, geology, mathematics, history, and a section near the window that appeared to be literature. Not decorative books. Working books, with cracked spines and paper slips, sticking out as bookmarks and margins she could see from 3 feet away were dense with handwriting. The maps were the second thing. Spread across a wide table near the north window and pinned to a flat board on the east wall, topographical surveys, geological charts, cross-section diagrams, with measurements annotated in the same small, precise hand she'd seen in Bram's marginal notes when he'd pointed something out to her on the trail. She turned and looked at him. He was standing near the fireplace adding wood, deliberately not looking at her, in the manner of a man who has shown someone a thing he normally keeps up private and is not entirely comfortable with the exposure. "You're not a hermit," she said. "I live alone," he said. "That's not the same thing." She looked at the shelves. A hermit doesn't have 300 books and survey maps of 6 counties. A man gets bored, Bram. She waited until he looked at her. "What do you actually do up here?" He set down the log he was holding and straightened. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man calculating something. "Come here," he said. He took her to the table with the maps and pushed aside the topographical surveys to reveal what was underneath, a second set of charts, these older and more detailed, with notations that she recognized immediately as survey marks. Her father's survey marks, she knew the notation system, had watched him use it as a child when he'd let her sit at his desk. And beside them, Bram's own charts, continuation surveys that picked up where her father's work had ended. "After your father died," Bram said, "I spent the fall finishing the survey he'd started. The complete deposit assessment. Depth, volume, grade, extraction difficulty." He laid a hand flat on the topmost chart. "It's all here, every number. And here," he pulled a different folder from beneath the stack, "is the registration copy. His original in his handwriting with his seal. One of 3 copies he made. I have this one." He gave the second to a lawyer in Billings he trusted. "The third should be in the Territorial Archive in Helena, if Rusk's people haven't found it." Maribel looked at the document. Her father's handwriting. His seal, the small stamp he'd used for every official document she'd ever seen him file, a simple border with his initials inside. "This is legal proof of ownership," she said. "If we can present it to the right authority, yes. Federal. Not territorial, if Rusk has reached into Helena. Federal land office would be harder for him to touch," Bram agreed. "There's a federal surveyor based in Billings. Man named Croft. I've corresponded with him. He's clean not connected to any of the territorial politics. Getting this to Croft is the objective." She pulled her eyes from the document and looked at him. "You've been planning this," she said. "I've been waiting for a moment when it was possible," he said carefully. "Which is different. You paid my debts with gold you'd been saving for. What, years?" He didn't answer immediately. "I had resources from the survey work," he said. "I don't spend much up here." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I've got," he said, and there was something in his voice, not quite irritation, but offense going up. That told her this was as far as he would go in this direction tonight. She let it go. She looked at the charts and the folder and the years of careful work spread across the table and thought about what it had cost him to do all of this alone, without knowing if the moment would ever come, without knowing if she would be the person standing on the other side of it, or if there would be someone to stand there at all. "We need to make copies," she said. "Multiple copies of everything. Different locations. I have supplies for it. And we need to think about how to get word to the lawyer in Billings without Rusk's people intercepting it. There's a trapper who runs a route south, twice a month. Comes within 6 miles of the lodge. He can carry a letter, he's done it before. He doesn't ask questions and he doesn't talk. When does he next run? 8 days, she calculated. 8 days, she said. If Rusk moves when the weather clears. He'll move within 5. She looked at him. Then we have 3 days less than we need, she said. Yes, he said. That is the problem. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. Show me the maps, she said. All of them. I need to understand this property the way you understand it. He sat across from her and pulled the topographical charts forward and began explaining. And she listened with the same quality of attention she had given the ledger the night before complete. Nothing wasted. And for the next 2 hours, they sat across that table in the firelight and worked through the geography of what they were dealing with. The terrain, the mineral deposit, the access routes, the distances. He was a clear teacher. He didn't condescend. When she asked questions, he answered them directly. And when she made an observation that required him to revise something he'd said, he revised it without defending himself. She'd never encountered a man who did that, without it costing him something visibly. Around the third hour, her hand cramped from taking notes, and she flexed it and set the pen down and said, without planning to, "My father used to teach me like this." Sitting across a table, Bram looked at her. "What did he teach you?" he said. "Surveying. Basic mathematics, land law. He started when I was 8. She looked at her hand. "I thought at the time he was just passing time with me. Later, I realized he was educating me the way he wished he'd been educated, everything practical, everything applicable." She paused. "I used to resist the land law sections because I thought they were dry. And now? Now I think he knew exactly what I would need." Bram was quiet for a moment. "He talked about you a lot," he said, "when we were working. He said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever met, and he meant it as a compliment." She laughed, a short, surprised sound that she hadn't planned on making, the first time she'd laughed in what felt like weeks. Bram looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between startled and something softer. "He wasn't wrong," she said. "I noticed," he said, which was the driest thing he'd said in 3 days. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and she laughed again, quieter this time, and something between them shifted. Not dramatically, nothing that could be named or addressed, but shifted in the way that trust shifts when it starts to become something else, without either party authorizing the change. She looked back at the maps. "We need to talk about what happens when they come," she said. "We do. You know this terrain in a way they don't." "Yes, that's an advantage. It's one advantage. They'll have numbers. How many men can Rusk put together for something like this? In winter, 20, maybe 25. Men who'll ride in this weather for what Rusk pays them aren't common. But they exist." She studied the topographical map, the ridge lines, the natural choke points, the areas where the terrain funneled movement, and the areas where it spread it wide. "You built this lodge with a specific relationship to the terrain," she said slowly. "The placement you chose it. Good water," he said. "Shelter from the north wind. And excellent sightlines in 3 directions," she said. "And a single accessible approach from the south that passes through." She put her finger on the map. "Here, where the ridge narrows." He looked at the map. "You read topography," he said. "My father taught me," she said. "What's in that approach? Between the narrowing and the lodge?" He was quiet for a moment. "A lot of loose rock," he said. "A creek crossing that's manageable in summer and considerably less so in January. 2 places where the slope above the trail is unstable, in ways I know and they won't." She looked at him. "Show me," she said. He reached for a pen and began marking the map, and she leaned forward to see, and outside the wind picked up again. And somewhere south of them, a weather system was breaking up and would clear by morning, and Vernon Rusk was sitting in his warm office in Cedar Hollow making his own calculations, and the clock that had been ticking since September was running now toward something neither of the 2 people at that table could fully control, and they both knew it. But they were working. Together, across a table covered in her father's maps and a dead man's evidence, 2 people who had met 4 days ago were building something out of the wreckage of what Rusk had destroyed. Not yet strong enough to stand against 25 armed men. Not yet. But something. She took the pen when he offered it and marked 2 points on the map where she'd noticed something in the terrain description he'd given that he hadn't fully drawn out. "What about here?" she said. He looked at her mark. "Yes," he said. And for the first time all day, his voice carried something that might have been, quietly, something like hope. "Yes, exactly there." Outside, the temperature was dropping fast, the kind of drop that happens when the sky finally clears after a storm, and the stars were beginning to appear, hard and bright and very cold, and the mountain was settling into the particular silence of winter nights above the tree line. Inside the lodge, the fire was burning steady, and the lamps were lit, and on the table the maps were filling with marks. They worked until nearly midnight, and when they finally stopped, it wasn't because they had finished. There was more to do than 2 days could handle, but because Maribel had read the same line of the survey notes 3 times without taking it in, and that was her body telling her something she needed to listen to. Bram showed her to a room at the back of the lodge small, a cot with a blanket that smelled like cedar, a hook on the wall for her coat. It was spare and it was private and it was warm, and she did not know how to express what those three things together meant after the last 4 days, so she didn't try. "There's a bolt on the inside of the door," he said, "from the doorway, in case you want it." "I know," she said, "thank you." He nodded and left, and she sat on the cot and listened to his footsteps moving back toward the main room, and then the sound of him banking the fire down for the night, and then silence. She took the ledger out of the satchel and held it in her lap. Her father had written his name on the inside front cover, just his name, in the neat hand she'd known since childhood. Not an address, not a date, just Elias Sutter, as if he were staking a claim. She put the ledger in the satchel and put the satchel under the cot where she could reach it without sitting up. And she took off her boots and lay down on the cot, with her coat over the blanket for extra warmth, and she stared at the ceiling of the small room. Rusk would move when the weather cleared. They had maybe 3 days. And somewhere between this room and a federal land office in Billings, there was a case strong enough to bring down a man who owned the sheriff and half the valley. If they could stay alive long enough to make it. She closed her eyes. He was trying to protect everyone Rusk was going to come after next.
She thought about the Garfield boy and the 3 families in the ledger and the payment receipt from 1,885
that the lawyer had set aside with an expression of perfect patience. When she slept without dreams. Her body was too tired for anything that elaborate. But when she woke before dawn to the sound of Bram already moving in the kitchen, already starting the day, she lay still for 30 seconds and let herself notice, carefully, that for the first time since September, she did not feel entirely alone. Then she got up, put her boots on, and went to work. The morning she got up before dawn and went to work turned out to be the first of 8 such mornings, and by the 4th one, it had stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling like the shape of a day. Bram was always up first. She never caught him sleeping, never heard him stir in the night. He simply appeared in the kitchen before light, fire already going, coffee already on, moving through the space with the quiet efficiency of a man who has lived alone long enough that all his habits have been compressed down to their essential form. He didn't talk much in the early hours, which suited her, because she needed the first cup of coffee to organize her thoughts into anything resembling order. And she had never been the kind of woman who pretended otherwise. They had developed a working rhythm without discussing it, which she found easier than discussing it would have been. Mornings she spent on the financial records reconstructing her father's business history from the documents in her satchel, cross-referencing the ledger entries, building a timeline that could be presented to a federal authority in a form that told the story clearly and left no gaps for a clever lawyer to slip through. Afternoons, Bram took her outside, the outside part she had not anticipated. The first day, he'd handed her a pair of snowshoes and taken her 300 yards up the slope behind the lodge and spent 2 hours showing her how the terrain above the south approach behaved in cold. Not telling her, showing her. Making her look at the way snow loaded on certain shelves of rock and not others, the way a specific formation of granite created a natural funnel that channeled wind and with it sound, the places where the ground looked stable and wasn't. "Why does that matter?" she asked the first day, pointing at a section of slope that looked to her like every other section of slope. "Because when 20 men are moving through that approach in single file," he said, "the third man's position tells you where the first man is going to be in 40 seconds. If you know the terrain, you know where everyone is before they know where they are." She looked at the slope differently after that. The second afternoon, he started teaching her to shoot with the rifle she'd brought, her father's Henry repeating rifle, which she'd handled before, but not with any real proficiency. Bram was not an impatient teacher, but he was a precise one. He corrected her grip 3 times before he was satisfied, and when she put a shot 6 inches left of where she'd aimed at 30 yards, he didn't tell her it was a good try. He told her she was dropping her right shoulder at the moment of firing and showed her what that looked like from behind, and then had her do it again. She appreciated the honesty more than she would have appreciated the encouragement. By the 4th afternoon, she was hitting consistently at 50 yards and had started to understand what the rifle wanted from her. The particular stillness required at the moment of the shot, the way her own breathing was the primary variable she needed to manage. It was more mathematical than she'd expected. That helped. The copying work happened in the evenings. They made 3 complete copies of the survey documents, Bram's hand for the technical charts, Maribel's for the legal filings, and wrapped each set in oilcloth and sealed them with wax. One set went into a cavity in the stone wall of the root cellar behind the lodge, behind a loose stone Bram had prepared years ago. One set went into the saddlebag of the dark gelding in the barn, distributed through the gear in a way that wouldn't be immediately apparent to someone searching the horse's kit. The third set she kept with her father's ledger in the satchel. "If something happens to either of us," she said on the 5th evening, sealing the last package, "the copy in the root cellar survives. And if the lodge is taken, the horse. And if they take the horse," she looked at him, "then the satchel. And if the satchel is gone, then Billings, because the lawyer your father trusted still has his copy." She paused. "We're building redundancy into the evidence." "Yes. My father thought this way," she said. "He always made 2 of everything important. I thought it was a nervous habit." "It's an engineering habit," Bram said. "Single points of failure make systems brittle." She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was making his scar less stark than it looked in daylight. In this light, he just looked like a man who'd had a hard decade, which was accurate. "Where did you get that?" she asked. She hadn't asked before. He glanced at her. He knew what she meant. "Mining dispute," he said. 1880. "The story people tell in town." "People in town don't know the details." "What are the details?" He was quiet for a moment. "A man I was working with was taking samples from a claim that didn't belong to him. I told him to stop. He had a knife and a temper." Bram looked at the sealed package in his hands. "He was faster than I expected. I was angrier than was smart." "What happened to him?" "He lived," Bram said. "I left the mining company. Went back to survey work." A pause. "Ended up working with your father the following spring." She nodded slowly. "So the story in town that you killed a man is wrong," he said. "But I didn't correct it. A reputation for being dangerous keeps people from testing you." She thought about that. "That's also an engineering solution," she said. He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved, that almost smile she had started to watch for without meaning to. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we go over the eastern approach." They went over the eastern approach the next morning, and the western one in the afternoon, and by the end of the 6th day, Maribel could draw the terrain around the lodge from memory and identify, without looking at the map, the 7 positions Bram had designated as defensible and the 4 he'd designated as dangerous for exactly the reasons that made them look attractive. She practiced moving between them in the snow. She timed herself. The first run took her 4.5 minutes. By the 3rd run, it was under 3. "That's the emergency route," he said, watching her. "If the lodge itself is compromised, I'm not leaving the lodge. If the lodge is on fire, you're leaving the lodge." "Fair distinction," she allowed. "The evidence travels with you. The satchel goes on your back and does not come off. Everything else is secondary." "Including you?" He looked at her steadily. "I know this mountain. I'm harder to kill here than I look." "You look fairly hard to kill as it stands," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Don't test that assumption," he said. It was the closest either of them had come to saying directly that they were worried about what was coming, and it landed in the space between them, with a weight that neither of them addressed. She picked up the rifle and headed back toward the lodge, and he followed, and they didn't speak again until dinner. The trapper came on the 8th day. He appeared at the tree line to the south in the early afternoon, a compact man on a spotted horse, with 2 mules behind him, loaded with furs, and a posture that said he'd been in these mountains long enough to have stopped noticing them. His name, Bram told her, was Deeks. He had no first name that anyone used or possibly knew. Deeks tied his animals at the porch rail, and came inside and accepted coffee, and did not look at Maribel with any particular curiosity, which she appreciated. He and Bram had the conversation that men have when they've known each other for years, and have no interest in catching up brief, informational, efficient. "South is clear," Deeks said. "Snow's down to manageable on the lower passes." "When did the storm break?" Bram asked. "Day before yesterday." "Full clear yesterday morning." Bram and Maribel looked at each other across the table. 2 days. Rusk had had 2 days of clear weather, which meant he'd had 2 days to organize and move, which meant they were not 3 days behind schedule. They were already behind. "I need you to carry something to Billings," Bram said. "I run south in 5 days," Deeks said. "I need it carried now." Deeks looked at his coffee. "That's not my route." "I'll pay your rate for the full run," Bram said. "Plus the detour." A pause. "What am I carrying?" "Letters. 3 of them." He glanced at Maribel. "Legal matter." Deeks looked at Maribel for the first time directly. He was perhaps 60, with eyes that had seen enough weather and enough of what people do to each other that they had arrived at a permanent state of neutral assessment. "This the Sutter woman?" he said. Maribel held very still. "You know who I am," she said. "Know who you are. Know who's looking for you." He picked up his coffee. Rusk's men were asking around at the lower trading post 3 days ago, asking which trappers run north. The word that was in the room was already. Neither of them said it. "Did anyone tell them?" Brams said. "Couple of fellows might have mentioned I run north sometimes," Deke said without inflection. "I wasn't there. I heard about it later from the postkeeper." Bram set down his cup. "Then you taking letters south is a risk for you," he said. "I want you to know that." Deeks was quiet for a moment. "I knew Elias Sutter," he said to his coffee cup. "Decent man. Bought a mule off him in '83. Gave me a fair price and threw in the tack." He looked up. "I'll take the letters." Maribel exhaled. She spent the next hour writing 3 letters to the Federal Land Office surveyor in Billings, to the lawyer her father had trusted, and to a woman in Helena named Clara Dane, whose name appeared 3 times in her father's ledger as a correspondent, and who had, based on the context, some connection to the territorial committee that Maribel hadn't yet fully worked out. The letters were careful and specific, not emotional, not pleading. They laid out facts, referenced documents, and named names. She wrote them the way her father would have written them, like a surveyor filing a report, everything measured and precise. Bram sealed them and gave them to Deeks with payment, and Deeks put them in an inside pocket without examining them and finished his coffee and left. They watched him ride south from the porch. "Is he reliable?" she asked. "He's never not been," Bram said. "That's all I can tell you. It'll have to be enough." They went inside, and Bram stood at the north window for a moment, looking at the ridge above the south approach, and she knew what he was looking at. "How long from the lower pass to here?" she said. "If they're moving. In this snow? Mounted, knowing the route 2 days, maybe less. And they don't know the route. They don't know my route," he said. "They'll find a route." "Which is slower." "Yes. Then we have time." "We have some time," he said. "Which is different." She picked up her rifle from the rack beside the door. "Then show me the rock slide preparation you mentioned," she said. "The eastern slope. You said there was a way to use the snow loading against them." He turned from the window. "I said it was possible in theory," he said. "Let's make it practical." They spent the rest of that day on the eastern slope, and the day after on the south approach, and on the morning of the 3rd day after Deeks left. Maribel woke before dawn to a sound that shouldn't have been there, and lay completely still for 10 seconds, sorting through it before she identified it. Hoofbeats on frozen ground. Approaching from the south. Single rider, moving fast. She was up and had the rifle in her hands before the sound fully resolved. She came into the main room to find Bram already at the north window, dressed, which meant he'd heard it too. "One horse," she said. "Yes. Not Rusk's men, they wouldn't send one." "No." "Then who?" The rider hit the clearing at the front of the lodge at speed and pulled up hard, the horse's hooves throwing up clods of frozen snow, and the figure in the saddle was not what either of them expected. Not a man. A boy, maybe 16, in a coat that was too thin for the weather, and with the face of someone who had been riding for a very long time in considerable fear. Bram had the door open before the boy fully dismounted. The boy was breathing hard, bent forward with his hands on his knees. "I need Bram Veylor." "You've got him," Bram said. The boy looked up. He had a cut above his right eye that had been bleeding and stopped and bled again. "I was sent by Deputy Carver, Hal Carver. He said you'd know him." Bram went very still. "I know him," he said carefully. "He's Peck's deputy." "He was Peck's deputy," the boy said. "He quit 3 days ago." Rusk tried. He stopped, caught his breath. Rusk told Peck to have Carver shoot a man named Aldine. Said Aldine was coming back from Oregon and had documents that needed to not exist. Carver refused. Rusk fired him on the spot, and then he stopped again. "Where's Carver?" Bram said. "He's hurt, about 4 miles south. He tried to ride north to warn you, and Rusk's men caught him on the lower trail. He got away, but he took a shot." The boy looked at Maribel. "He said to tell you. He said Rusk isn't sending men. He already sent them. They left Cedar Hollow 2 days ago. More than 20, Rusk's riding with them himself." The silence in the room was the specific silence of people absorbing information that changes the shape of everything. "They're already on the mountain," Maribel said. "Yes, ma'am." Bram moved. He moved the way he moved when he wasn't thinking about anything except the problem fast and without wasted motion, going to the barn first, coming back with rope, then to the root cellar, then to a locked chest under the north table she hadn't seen opened before. He was pulling things out and organizing them, and his hands were steady, which was steadier than she felt. "You," he said to the boy. "Can you ride back to Carver?" "Yes, sir. Take the spotted mare from the barn. She's sure-footed and she's got more left in her than your horse does. Bring Carver here if he can be moved. If he can't, come back and tell me exactly where he is." "Yes, sir. What's your name?" "Ellis, sir." "Ellis. Do not take the south trail. Go east half a mile first, then south. There's a cattle path, do you know it?" The boy shook his head. "Pine with a split trunk, 20 yards east of here. You'll see it from the clearing. Turn south when you hit the flat rock below it. That takes you around the main approach. Rusk's men will be coming up the center." The boy absorbed this with the focused expression of someone who understands that the instruction matters and is determined not to forget it. "Pine with a split trunk," he said, 20 yards east. South on the flat rock. Go, Bram, move." The boy went. Maribel was already at the table with the topographical map spread out. "He's riding with them," she said. "That changes the leverage." "How so?" Bram pulled on his outer coat and started checking the contents of the pack he'd assembled. "If Rusk is on this mountain personally, the men with him are operating differently than if he sent them from town. They're here because he told them to come. In winter, up a mountain. That means some of them are loyal, but some of them are simply paid, and paid men make different decisions when the situation changes." "You're thinking about the ledger," he said. "I'm thinking about the families in the ledger. Some of those men riding with Rusk-Thier families are in that ledger. They're neighbors." She looked at the map. If they knew what he did. Getting them to read a document in the middle of a firefight. Not read. Here. She looked up. If I could get in front of even some of them before this becomes a shooting situation. Maribel. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her with the flat, direct expression that meant he was about to say something she might not like. "These men were told to find us and bring back documents. Some of them were told to make sure the documents are the only thing that comes back. I know that. Knowing it and planning around it are different things. I know that too." She looked at the map. "I'm not saying we walk down there and present our case. I'm saying there may be a moment after the terrain does what we've planned for it to do. When some of those men are standing in the aftermath of Rusk's decisions, on a mountain they don't know, having just watched what this place can do, and in that moment, there might be a window." He looked at her for a long time. "If there's a window," he said finally, "we'll find it. But we plan for the terrain first." "Agreed." He turned back to the pack, and she turned back to the map, and they worked in parallel for the next hour in near silence. Bram preparing everything physical that needed preparing. Maribel thinking through the sequence of what the terrain would do, and what it would leave behind, and what that created. The rock slide preparations had taken 2 days. The eastern slope above the south approach had a natural instability that Bram had identified years ago, a shelf of granite held in place, largely by the particular way the snow had packed over 2 seasons, with an underlying drainage problem that turned the ground beneath it into something close to mud when the temperature cycled. They hadn't created the instability. They'd created the means of triggering it deliberately, and at a chosen moment, using a technique Bram had described to her as persuasion, a specific sequence of cuts and placements that would allow a single action to start a process the mountain would finish on its own. It wasn't going to stop 25 men. It was going to scatter them, create confusion, separate the group from itself and from Rusk's command. And in that confusion, the defensive positions they'd prepared. The 3 points where the terrain channeled movement into places where 2 people who knew where they were standing had significant advantage over a larger group that would matter. The warning line, she said, north perimeter, already set. Trip lines at knee level on the northeast approach paired with the tin percussion caps. He looked at her. "You know what that sound means when you hear it. Someone on the north approach. Don't go to the window. Go to the back door. Take the root cellar route and hold at position 3 until you hear the signal. 2 shots, pause, 1 shot." Yes, she looked at him. "And if I hear shooting and I don't hear that signal, then something's wrong and you use your judgment." He met her eyes, which I trust. She hadn't expected him to say that. She looked back at the map. "There's something else," she said. "What?" "Carver came up here to warn us. He quit rather than do what Rusk told him to do, and then he rode toward us instead of away." She paused. "That means he's not the only person in Cedar Hollow who's reached the limit of what they'll do for Rusk." "Peck hasn't," Bram said. "Peck is Rusk's instrument, not his conscience. But Carver, there will be others like Carver. People who have gone along because the cost of not going along was too high, and who have been waiting for something to change the calculation. She looked at the lodge around her, the books, the maps, the evidence stacked in oilcloth packages. We're not just trying to survive this. We're trying to build something that those people can stand beside afterward. He didn't answer immediately. One thing at a time, he said finally. I know, but I'm telling you why the outcome matters beyond just us. She folded the map. Because I think you already know that. I think you've known it for 2 years, sitting up here, building this case. And I think it's part of why you walked into that livestock hall. He picked up his pack and settled it on his shoulders. We need to set the eastern trigger before dark, he said. She picked up her rifle. Then let's go. They were halfway up the eastern slope, Maribel carrying the coil of rope and Bram carrying the tools needed for the trigger mechanism, when Ellis came back. He came from the east, he'd followed the instructions, and he was moving faster than before, which told her before he spoke that the news had changed. Carver's coming, the boy called up the slope. He can ride. He's about 20 minutes behind me. How bad is the wound? Bram called down. Left side. He's staying in the saddle. Get to the barn. Put both horses inside and keep them there. Yes, sir. The boy hesitated. There's something else. Coming down the south trail. I didn't see them, but I heard them. Horses, more than one, maybe half a mile out. Bram and Maribel looked at each other. Half a mile on the south approach in this snow was perhaps 20 minutes. Fewer if they pushed. The trigger mechanism was not set. How much of it can we do in 10 minutes? She said. He was already calculating, looking up the slope with the expression of a man running numbers fast. The primary cut, he said. Not the secondary. 1 trigger instead of 2. Is 1 enough? For the first wave, yes. The second wave will come through more cautiously, which is actually better for the defensive positions. Then we do 1, she said. Show me what you need me to do. He showed her. She did it. They worked on that slope with the efficiency of people who have been working together for 8 days and have stopped needing to explain every step to each other. And when the primary trigger was set and covered and indistinguishable from the surrounding snowpack to any eye that didn't know it was there, they came back down the slope and went to the lodge, and Bram went directly to the locked chest and came out with a second rifle and began loading it with a particular calm of a man who has made his decision and is past the point of second-guessing it. Carver arrived 12 minutes later. He was older than she'd expected, mid-40s, lean, with a former deputy's posture still visible under the pain of a left-side wound that had been wrapped in something that used to be a shirt. He dismounted at the porch rail, with the careful movement of a man who has identified which motions hurt and is executing around them. Bram came out and helped him inside without ceremony. Maribel looked at the man's face while Bram got him to a chair. He had the look of someone who had made a decision he knew was right and was still working out what it was going to cost him. Carver, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said, for coming. He shook his head slightly. Not dismissal, just the private gesture of a man uncomfortable with acknowledgement. Aldine, he said, the man from Oregon. He's real. He's coming. He has documents. He stopped, pressed his hand against his side. He wrote to Rusk 2 weeks ago. Said he had papers from your father about the original loan. Proof that the interest rate was never agreed to. Rusk panicked. He looked at Maribel. That's why he moved. Not just about you. Aldine's documents combined with whatever you've got. He knew it was over if both of you were standing. Maribel felt something click into place. Aldine is coming here, she said. No, Helena. He's going to the Territorial Land Office. Carver looked at Bram. Which is where Rusk has reached, Bram said. Not anymore, Carver said, and there was something in his voice that had the quality of a card being laid on the table. The man Rusk had in the land office, his name was Forsyth. He retired sudden last week. There's a new man in the office. Name of Braddock. He came from the Federal Surveyor's office in Billings. He looked at Maribel. I don't know if you know that name. Maribel stared at him. Croft sent someone, she said, almost to herself. We sent the letters 8 days ago. Croft moved before we even. He'd already been watching. So had someone else, Carver said. The woman in Helena. Dane. She's been collecting statements for months. From the families. From anyone who'd talk. He stopped again. Your father wasn't the only one building a case. He just didn't know he had company. The quiet in the room was different from before. Not the quiet of people absorbing bad news, but something more complicated. The quality of pieces arriving that should have been separate but weren't. He wasn't alone, Maribel said softly. Outside, something moved on the south approach. Distant. The sound traveled differently in cold air, and she was learning to read it. Not a single horse, several. Moving with the careful, deliberate pace of men who know they're getting close and are adjusting accordingly. Bram stood up. Ellis, he said. The boy appeared from the kitchen doorway, where he'd been trying to be invisible. Take Carver to the back room. You know where the root cellar door is. Yes, sir. If you hear me fire twice and then once, you take him out that door and you don't stop moving east. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Carver. The former deputy looked at him. Can you shoot left-handed? A pause. Can't shoot right-handed at the moment, Carver said, so I suppose I'll find out. Bram handed him a revolver from the chest. Carver took it and let Ellis help him toward the back. Maribel was already at the north window, watching the approach. She could see them now. Movement in the tree line. The dark shapes of horses against the snow, spreading out in the deliberate pattern of men who've been told to disperse and close from multiple directions. She counted 6 visible. Counted the gaps. There were more. They split, she said. They're coming from the east and south both. The south group will hit the trigger, Bram said. If they take the central path, they'll take it. It's the only clear line. She adjusted her grip on the rifle. How do we know when they hit it? She said. He looked at her. We'll know, he said. He was right. 40 seconds later, the mountain answered that question with a sound like the world clearing its throat, a low, accelerating roar from the eastern slope above the south approach, followed by the particular crashing percussion of rock and snow, moving in volume down a slope that had been holding them for 2 seasons, and had now decided, with some encouragement, to let go. Then the shouting started. Maribel stood at the north window and listened to Vernon Rusk's 25 armed men encounter. For the first time, the fact that this mountain did not belong to them, and that the 2 people they'd come to take had spent 8 days making sure of it. She took a breath, steadied her shoulder, and waited for what came next. The roar from the eastern slope lasted perhaps 12 seconds. It felt longer. The sound rolled down the mountain and hit the lodge walls like something physical, and then it was over, and what replaced it was the kind of silence that follows catastrophic noise. Hollow, ringing, absolute. Then the shouting started in earnest. Maribel couldn't make out words at first. Just voices men, calling to each other in the disordered way of a group that has just had its formation destroyed and is trying to reconstitute itself without a clear picture of what happened. She counted at least 8 distinct voices from the south approach, which meant the slide had not caught all of them. Some had been behind the trigger point. Some had seen or heard enough warning to pull back. East group, Bram said from behind her. She moved to the east-facing window. 3 riders had cleared the tree line and were moving toward the lodge, across the open ground northeast of the barn, keeping low, spreading apart from each other. Not panicking. These were men who'd done this kind of work before, and the slide had not touched them, and they were using the confusion as cover. They'll reach the barn in 2 minutes, she said. Don't let them reach the barn. She opened the east window 2 inches and put the rifle barrel through the gap and fired once. Not at the riders, at the frozen ground 10 feet ahead of the leaded horse. The shot cracked and threw up a spray of ice, and the horse shied hard left, and the rider fought it for 3 full seconds before getting it back under control. The 3 men stopped. They looked at the lodge. Then they looked at each other. Move back, she called through the window, loud and clear. This is private property, and you are not welcome on it. One of the men called back something she couldn't hear clearly over the distance. She fired again, closer this time, and the 3 horses danced backward, and one of the riders lost a stirrup and grabbed the saddle horn. Back, she said again. They backed. It wouldn't hold them long. She knew that. But every minute they spent regrouping was a minute. The main group from the south approach was also not coordinated, and uncoordinated men with rifles were less dangerous than organized ones. Behind her, Bram moved to the south window. 7 coming up from below, he said. Spread across the clearing, Peck's with them. Peck came himself. Apparently. Where's Rusk? A pause. I don't see him. She didn't like that. Rusk not visible was worse than Rusk in the open. A man like Vernon Rusk did not come up a mountain in January to stand in a clearing and take fire. He came with a plan, and his plan had a specific position in it for himself, and she needed to know what that position was. Ellis, she called toward the back. Yes, ma'am. The boy appeared in the kitchen doorway. Stay with Carver. Do not open the root cellar door unless you hear our signal. Yes, ma'am. If someone tries to come through the back wall, I'll make noise, he said. She looked at him. He was scared, which was appropriate, but he was also standing still and listening carefully, which was what mattered. Good, she said. Make a lot of it. She went back to the east window. The 3 riders had pulled back to the tree line and were conferring. One of them was pointing at the barn. She understood the logic. The barn gave them cover and a flanking angle on the lodge. They weren't wrong about that. She needed to change the angle. I'm going to position 2, she told Bram. He turned from the south window. The slide is settled. Position 2 covers the barn approach and still has a line on the northeast corner. The roof, I know about the roof. Position 2 was a flat rock outcropping 15 yards northeast of the lodge, partially sheltered by the curve of the hill behind it, with a gap in the pine line that gave her a clear angle on the barn and the northeastern approach, but kept her out of the direct sight line from the south. She and Bram had walked it 6 times. She knew every inch. He looked at her for a moment. Signal if you need to fall back, he said. 2 fast shots. Yes. He reached out and gripped her arm briefly once. Hard, the kind of grip that says something that isn't going into words, and then let go and turned back to the south window. She went out the back door, low and fast, hit the snow running, and made the rock outcropping in under 2 minutes, which was slower than her best time. But her best time had been practice, and this was not practice. She pressed herself into the curve of the hill, got the rifle up, and looked across to the barn. The 3 riders from the tree line were moving again. She could see all 3 of them clearly now, big men in heavy coats, one with a repeating rifle across his saddle, one with a shotgun she didn't want to think about in terms of close range, one apparently relying on the revolver at his hip. They were moving in a spread formation toward the barn's east side, using the barn itself as a screen against the lodge's windows. Smart. She gave them that. She waited until the lead rider was 20 feet from the barn door. Last warning, she called. The man with the repeating rifle swung it toward her voice. She was already moving 2 feet left along the rock, not where her voice had been, and his shot hit the pine behind her original position with a crack that stripped bark. She fired back, and the rifle spun out of his hands. She hadn't aimed for his hands. She'd aimed for center mass and missed left, which was the shoulder dropping problem Bram had corrected on the 4th day. The rifle going down told her she'd hit the forearm or wrist. The man didn't fall. He pulled up his horse and held his arm against his chest and turned the animal hard and rode back toward the tree line, and the 2 men with him made the same decision simultaneously. She stayed low and watched them go. Her hands were not entirely steady. She noticed that, took a breath, and let it pass. The rifle needed to be steady, and that she could control. The rest she left alone. From the south, the shouting was getting organized. That was the problem with time. It ran out. She came back to the lodge through the back door to find Bram at the south window, and the south clearing occupied by a different situation than she'd left. Peck's group had spread into a line across the clearing's south edge, using the tree line as cover, and they were no longer moving. They had taken up positions, which meant they were waiting for something. They're waiting for Rusk to tell them what to do, she said. Yes. Where is he? Still don't know. Bram's voice was level, but there was something tight underneath it. 2 men went west around the lodge 15 minutes ago. I didn't take a shot because I didn't want to tell them where I was positioned. They went west. She thought about the terrain west of the lodge. The ground there was rough but passable, and it opened into a shallow depression behind the root cellar, a natural approach to the back of the building that they had discussed and prepared for, and had assigned as her responsibility in the event of a north approach. The root cellar. Bram, she said. I know, he said. Go. She went through the back room, past the door where she could hear Carver's unsteady breathing and Ellis's deliberate silence, and she opened the back door 2 inches and listened. Footsteps. Not from the north. From the west side of the building, moving around toward the back, being careful but not careful enough. Snow tells things about how people walk, where they're placing their weight, whether they're moving fast or slow. 2 people. Moving slow. She stepped back and set herself beside the door frame. Not in front of it, not behind it. Beside it at an angle that let her see the door handle and the 3-inch gap of outside. The door opened inward. She waited. The first man came through fast and low, the way a man comes through a door when he's expecting trouble, and he was in the room before he saw her, and she hit him with the rifle stock across the side of his head. Not full force, controlled, The way Bram had shown her on the fourth day when she'd pushed for it, and he'd spent an hour making sure she understood the mechanics. The man went into the wall and down and made a sound like furniture falling. The second man appeared in the doorway, and she had the rifle leveled at his chest. He was young, maybe 22, 23, with a face that had gone completely white. "Put it down," she said. He had a pistol in his right hand. He looked at his partner on the floor. He looked at Maribel. "I said put it down," she said. "On the ground, grip first and step away from it." He put it down. He stepped away from it. She kept the rifle on him. "What's your name?" she said. He stared at her. "I'm going to ask you once more," she said, "and then I'm going to assume you're not going to be useful to me, which makes this situation go differently for you." "Pruitt," he said. "Tom Pruitt. All right, Tom Pruitt. How many men does Rusk have on this mountain right now?" He looked at his partner on the floor. 23. "We started with 23. How many did the slide take down?" 4, or he swallowed. 4 couldn't ride after. 3 more went back with them. So 12, after the men I turned back from the barn. She did the math. Plus Peck's group in the south clearing. That's 7, which means Rusk has 4 men unaccounted for. Pruitt said nothing, which was an answer. "Where is he?" she said. Pruitt's jaw worked. "He'll kill me," he said. "He's not here," she said. "I am. And I'm telling you that the man who sent you up this mountain has been stealing from families in this valley for 15 years, and I have the documentation to prove every single transaction. And that documentation is going to a federal land officer in Billings, who has no connection to Vernon Rusk and cannot be bought." She watched his face. "One of those families is named Garfield. Does that mean anything to you?" Something moved in his expression. "My mother is a Garfield," he said very quietly. She kept the rifle level, but something in her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but different. "Then you know what Rusk did to that family," she said. "Your uncle's land. The legal trouble that went away for a price." He was quiet. "He's coming up from the west side," Pruitt said. "He went west with Dowd and 2 others. There's a game trail that comes out behind the root cellar." The root cellar. She'd left 1 package in the root cellar wall. "How long ago did he go west?" "Before the slide. Maybe 20 minutes before. He wasn't going to come up the south approach. He said that was for drawing fire. 20 minutes before the slide. Which meant Rusk had been moving for half an hour. Which meant he was close or already here." She made a decision fast. "That man on the floor," she said. "He's alive, breathing. He'll have a headache. You're going to stay in this room with him. And you're not going to move. If I hear you move, I will know it, and I will not give you the opportunity to explain yourself. Do you understand?"
"Yes,
Pruitt said.
if you're telling me the truth about the Garfield land."
"If you testify to what you know, there is a path through this for you that doesn't end with federal charges." She looked at him hard. "That is not a promise. That is a possibility. Whether you get there depends on what you do in the next 20 minutes. She went back into the main room. "Rusk is on a game trail west," she told Bram. "Coming to the root cellar. He's been moving for 30 minutes. Bram set the rifle down. "That's where the document cache is," he said. "Yes. He knows about the root cellar. He must," someone told him. She thought briefly, bitterly, about who in Cedar Hollow might have known enough to tell. Then she let it go because it didn't matter right now. "You need to hold the south window," she said. He looked at her. "Maribel Peck is in the south clearing with 6 men. If they come across while both of us are at the back, we lose the lodge." She picked up her rifle and checked the load. "I know where the root cellar is. I know every inch of that approach. We've walked it 14 times. Rusk doesn't come alone," Bram said. "He brought Dowd. He's not someone to underestimate. How many times have you underestimated me?" He looked at her for a long second. "Once," he said, "at the livestock hall, when I thought I was rescuing someone." She looked back at him. "Hold the south window," she said. "I'll come back." She went out the back door at a low run and turned west, putting the lodge wall to her right, moving in the shadow of the building toward the root cellar. The cellar door was on the building's northwest side, built into the hillside with the good heavy door she'd noticed the first day. The game trail Pruitt described would come out of the trees approximately 30 yards northwest of that door. She got to the cellar door and stopped. The tracks were already there. Boot tracks, 4 sets, coming out of the tree line to the northwest and moving toward the cellar door. The tracks were maybe 10 minutes old, the edges still sharp in the cold, not yet softened by the slight warming that midday brought. They were inside. The heavy door was open 2 inches. Not thrown open carefully, precisely open. Someone who knew how to open a door without making sound. She stood outside it for 3 seconds. Then she pushed the door open with the rifle barrel and stepped inside. The root cellar was perhaps 12 feet deep, shelved on both sides with the preserved goods of 6 years of careful living. At the far end, the loose stone in the wall, the one she'd packed the document cache behind 10 days ago, was out of the wall and on the floor. Vernon Rusk was standing at the open cavity with the oilcloth package in his hands. He was exactly what he'd been in Cedar Hollow, composed, contained, the suit replaced by a heavy traveling coat, but the manner identical. As if the mountain were merely an inconvenient meeting room. 2 men stood in the cellar with him, positioned at the sides, and a third she hadn't seen larger than the others, with a face she would later learn, Dowd was 2 feet to her left when she came in, and he moved at the same moment she did. She swung the rifle toward Rusk. Dowd hit her arm. The rifle went off the shot, hit the ceiling, a plume of stone dust and splintered wood, and then Dowd had her arm twisted behind her at an angle that made her go up on her toes to stop it from breaking, and her rifle was on the floor, and she was standing 3 feet from Vernon Rusk, with nothing between them. He looked at her with the same patient expression she'd seen at the livestock hall. "Miss Sutter," he said, "you've made this a great deal more complicated than it needed to be." She breathed through the pain in her arm. Dowd had her locked but not moving, which meant he was holding and not escalating, which meant Rusk hadn't yet decided on the next step. "You came up here yourself," she said, "for documents." "I came up here to settle a business matter. My father called it a business matter too, right up until you had him killed." Something moved in Rusk's face, small, contained, but there. Not guilt. Something more like irritation at an imprecision. "Your father made a series of poor decisions," he said. "His first poor decision was letting someone know about the silver deposit," she said. "His last poor decision was trusting that the territorial legal system was functional enough to protect him." She held his eyes. "Neither of those was a poor decision, actually. They were reasonable assumptions that you corrupted." He looked at the oilcloth package in his hands. "There are copies," she said. "You already know that, or you wouldn't have come up here yourself. You would have sent someone else for the original and not worried about it. You came because you need all of them." He looked at her. "Where are the copies?" he said. "Not here, Miss Sutter." "They're not here," she said again. "And torturing the answer out of me wastes time you don't have, because in approximately 4 days a federal land officer named Braddock, who was placed in the Helena Land Office by the surveyor Croft in Billings, is going to receive a letter that describes every transaction in my father's ledger with specific names and dates." She watched his face. "You don't know about Croft." He didn't. She could see it. "And you don't know about Clara Dane and Helena," she said. "Or about the statements she's been collecting for months from the families you defrauded. Or about Aldine, coming back from Oregon with the original loan documents showing your interest rate was fraudulent from the start." She let that sit for a moment. "The case against you exists in 6 separate locations, Rusk. This package is one of them. Breaking it doesn't break the case." The root cellar was very quiet. One of the 2 men at the sides, not Dowd, the other one, on her right shifted his weight. She heard it but didn't look. She kept her eyes on Rusk. "What do you want?" he said. "The same thing my father wanted," she said. "For you to answer for what you've done." "That's not negotiable," he said flatly. "No," she agreed. "It's not. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here because you came to my property." Something changed in his expression then. Something colder, more direct, the composure finally dropping a fraction of an inch. "Your property," he said. "The Sutter Upper Parcel, 1,200 acres along the northern ridge, with a registered mineral claim in Elias Sutter's name that transfers to his heir." She kept her voice level. "Me, my property." And she looked pointedly at the package in his hands. "Is my document." He looked at the package. Then he looked at her. "Dowd," he said. Dowd tightened his grip on her arm. And the lodge door at the top of the root cellar steps opened. Bram came through it. He shouldn't have left the south window. She knew that, and she knew the moment she saw him that something had changed in the clearing. But he was here, ducking under the low doorframe, filling the entry in a way that made the root cellar suddenly feel considerably smaller, and the 2 men on the sides of the cellar looked at him and looked at each other. He was bleeding. Left side, above the hip his coat was dark with it, and she could see from the way he was holding himself that it was recent, and that he was operating through it on sheer will. He had the second rifle, and he had it pointed at Rusk. "Let her go," he said to Dowd. Dowd looked at Rusk. Let her go, Rusk said, which surprised her. But when Dowd released her arm and stepped back, she understood immediately why. Rusk set the oilcloth package down on the shelf beside him very carefully, like a man setting down something he intends to pick up again in a moment. He had a revolver. He'd had it the whole time. He drew it and pointed it at Bram, with the practice of a man who has done this before and is not afraid of the aftermath. Put the rifle down, Veylor, he said. Bram did not put the rifle down. The root cellar was 12 feet deep, and Rusk was at the back of it, and Bram was at the door, and Maribel was between them. With a twisted arm, she was rotating slowly to restore feeling, and her rifle on the floor 2 feet to her left. Maribel, Bram said, without looking at her. I see it, she said. She bent and picked up the rifle. Dowd moved, and she came up with the barrel toward his chest, and he stopped. I need everyone to stop moving, she said. No one moved. The 2 men on the sides of the cellar were looking at the door, then at Rusk, then at the door. She watched them making the calculation that men make when the situation has exceeded what they signed up for. They were paid men. They were not Dowd, who was something else. They were men who had ridden up a mountain for a payday, and the mountain had responded by burying 4 of their colleagues in a rock slide and shooting the rifle out of one man's hand. Your name, she said to the man on her right. He blinked. What? Your name, she said. Hatch, he said. Darren Hatch. Are you from the valley, Darren Hatch? A pause. Yes. What does Rusk pay you? He glanced at Rusk. Rusk's attention was on Bram and the revolver was still up. 40 a month, Hatch said. There's a ledger, she said. In my satchel in the lodge. My father kept it for 2 years. It documents every fraudulent transaction Rusk ran in this valley, the false debts, the manipulated interest, the land seizures. 3 families lost their properties the same way mine almost did. She watched him. Are you in that ledger? Hatch shook his head. Your family? She said, a different kind of silence. My wife's brother, he said slowly, lost his grazing rights in '84. Said he owed money he couldn't account for. The Presley grazing rights, she said. She'd read that entry 4 times. 40 acres on the South Flat, converted to debt under a note that was issued at standard rate and then reclassified after the fact at punitive rate. Your brother-in-law couldn't pay because the rate wasn't what he'd agreed to. She looked at him. He lost those acres. Hatch looked at Rusk, said, Hatch, he can get them back, Maribel said. When this is over and the territorial court reviews the fraudulent instruments, the properties revert. That only happens if there's a proceeding. That only happens if the evidence gets to the right people. She looked at both men on the sides, Hatch and the other one. That only happens if this ends without more people getting hurt on a mountain in January, for a man who used your families the same way he used mine. The other man on the left, she didn't know his name, set his rifle against the wall. Just set it there, leaned it against the stone, and took 1 step back and put his hands in front of him at waist height, in the universal position of a man removing himself from a situation. Hatch looked at him. Then he set his rifle against the other wall. Dowd hadn't moved. Dowd wasn't going to move without instruction. And Vernon Rusk had not lowered the revolver. He was looking at Bram, and in his expression was something she had not seen there before, something stripped of the patient composure, something raw underneath it. Not fear. Rusk was not afraid of consequences the way ordinary people are afraid of consequences. He was afraid of losing. Those were different things. You walked into my proceeding, Rusk said to Bram, with a bag of gold you'd spent years saving, for a woman you'd never met. He tilted his head slightly. Why? You already know why, Bram said, the silver. No, Bram said. Rusk's eyes moved to Maribel, for her then. I didn't know her, Bram said. I knew her father. And I knew what you did to him, and I knew what you were going to do to her, and I knew that the system you'd bought wasn't going to stop you. He kept the rifle up, and she could see in the set of his jaw what it was costing him to hold it steady with that wound. So I did. And now? Rusk said. Now you're going to lower that revolver, Bram said, and you're going to walk back down this mountain, and you're going to face what's coming. Because what's coming is already in motion, and it doesn't need us anymore. The letters are sent. The federal officer is placed. Dane has her statements. Aldine is in Helena. He looked at Rusk with the flat directness of a man who has been patient for a very long time, and is at the end of it. You can shoot me, and it doesn't change any of that. You just add another crime to the list. Rusk's hand was very still. The deed, he said. The mineral claim. Goes to probate and then to Maribel Sutter, Bram said. Under her father's registered claim. Which is legal and documented and witnessed, and which you cannot buy or threaten away Because the copies are in 4 places you don't know and 2 people you've never met. The revolver came down 2 inches. Just 2. But 2 was something. There are things I know, Rusk said, very quietly. That could make this complicated. Other parties, other interests. Federal processes take years. Yes, Maribel said, they do. And while they take years, the territorial court will review the fraudulent instruments, and the families will file for reversion. And Clara Dane will publish what she knows, and the Valley will learn what you are. She held his gaze. You can fight us for years if you want to. But the man you were in Cedar Hollow, the man who owned the sheriff and the bank and half the valley, that man is already gone. You just haven't accepted it yet. Rusk looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, and she looked back, and she did not look away. The revolver came down, not a surrender, not capitulation. The calculated decision of a man who has recognized that the immediate tactical situation has moved against him and is repositioning. She knew that. She didn't mistake it for anything else. Dowd, he said. Dowd stepped back. Rusk picked up the oilcloth package from the shelf. Put that down, Maribel said. He looked at her. She raised the rifle. That, she said, is my father's document. It belongs to me. And you are going to put it back on that shelf. Or I am going to make a decision that I will be entirely able to justify, given that you just held a gun on an injured man in my root cellar. Something passed through Rusk's expression, several things, actually, moving fast. He set the package down. She kept the rifle up until he turned and walked past Bram through the cellar door, and Dowd followed, and the 2 hired men, who had set their rifles against the walls, went after them without speaking, and she listened to their boots on the steps, and then on the frozen ground outside. Then she looked at Bram. He was holding himself very carefully against the doorframe, and his face had taken on a gray quality that told her the wound was worse than he'd shown Rusk. How bad, she said. I've had worse, he said. That is not an answer to my question. It's not deep. I need it packed and bound. He looked at her arm. How's your arm? Usable, she said. Then let's get back inside, he said, before someone outside changes their mind. She picked up the oilcloth package and held it against her chest, and they went up the steps together, him slower than usual, her watching him for the signs that it was worse than usable, and out into the cold white afternoon. Peck's group had gone from the south clearing. She could see the track's 8 horses, moving south, not at a run, but moving. Hatch and the other man from the root cellar were already at the tree line, following. Of Rusk and Dowd she could see nothing. The western trail was empty. Ellis appeared in the lodge doorway. Is it over? He said. Maribel looked at the empty clearing, at the tracks going south, at the mountains around them, still and white and indifferent, the same as they'd been before. 23 armed men tried to take something that didn't belong to them. For today, she said. She took Bram inside and put him in a chair and found the medical supplies he'd shown her in the 3rd day of their preparations, because he had prepared for this possibility along with every other, and she packed the wound with hands that were steadier than she expected and bound it tighter than comfortable, which he did not complain about. And when she was done, she sat back and looked at him. He looked terrible. He also looked like himself, which she had started to understand were not incompatible conditions. The south window, she said. You left it. Peck's group was already pulling back when I left it, he said. They heard the root cellar shot and saw Rusk's men heading west, and they didn't know what it meant. Men don't hold a line when they don't know what's happening on the other side of the building. You were guessing. I was calculating. And if you'd calculated wrong? He looked at her steadily. Then I'd have calculated wrong, he said. And I would have stayed at the south window while Rusk decided what to do with you in the root cellar. She held his gaze. Don't do that again, she said. All right, he said. Outside, the mountain was quiet. Inside, Carver's breathing had steadied, and Ellis was feeding the horses, and the fire needed tending. She got up and tended it, and the Ottopan tended it, and the afternoon light came through the north window at a low angle where the maps still lay with her marks on them from 10 days ago. And the lodge felt like what it had slowly become over those 10 days. Not Bram's lodge, not a hermit's refuge, but something that 2 people had inhabited together, and which held the shape of what that meant. She put another log on the fire and stood back and felt the heat on her face. Rusk was on his way down the mountain. He was not finished, she knew that, had said it out loud in the root cellar. A man like Rusk did not run, he repositioned. There were lawyers in Helena and political relationships and tactical retreats that would look, for a while, like nothing had changed. But the letters were sent. The evidence was copied 4 times over. Braddock was in the land office. Clara Dane had her statements. Aldine was coming. The mountain had held. She turned from the fire and looked at Bram, who had fallen into the particular unconsciousness of a wounded man whose body has decided that now is the time to do the repair work whether he agrees or not. His head was tipped back against the chair, and he was breathing slowly and evenly. And she stood there for a moment in the firelight and thought about a man who had spent 6 years alone on a mountain because the world below it had cost him something she still didn't fully know, and who had walked back into that world with a leather pouch of gold and done the most impractical, unreasonable, logically indefensible thing she had ever witnessed. And then had spent 10 days teaching her how to use everything he knew. She pulled the blanket from the back of the chair and put it across his lap without waking him. Then she sat down at the table and opened her father's ledger and started writing the account of what had happened on this mountain today. In her father's small, careful hand, everything measured and precise, because the record needed to be complete, and because Elias Sutter had taught her that you write it all down, and you write it down twice, and she was, it turned out, exactly her father's daughter. The account she wrote that night ran to 11 pages. She wrote until the fire burned low and the lamp oil was half gone, and her hand had cramped twice and been stretched and kept going, because the record needed to be complete. And because writing, it was the only thing that kept the afternoon from becoming something she had to feel instead of document. She wrote what Rusk said and what she said back. She wrote the names, Dowd, Hatch, Pruitt, the unnamed man who set his rifle against the wall first. She wrote the position of every person in the root cellar and the sequence of what happened. She wrote it the way a surveyor files a report, with times where she knew them and estimated times where she didn't. And at the end she signed it and dated it and folded it into the satchel with the ledger and the oilcloth package she'd taken back from the shelf. Bram woke around midnight and looked at the nearly dead fire, and then at her at the table and said, with the slightly unfocused quality of a man coming out of pain sleep, "You should rest." "I'm almost finished," she said. "You've been almost finished for 3 hours." She looked at the page in front of her. "How do you know how long I've been at it?" "I've been watching you for 3 hours," he said. She looked at him. He was still pale and moving with the careful economy of a man managing pain, but his eyes were clear. "Go back to sleep," she said. "The fire needs wood," he said, and got up before she could object, and she watched him add 2 logs with the deliberate slowness of a man who knows the limits of what he can do right now and is operating exactly at them, no further. She finished the 11th page and closed the ledger. "Done," she said. He settled back into the chair. "What did you write?" he said. "Everything that happened today. Detailed." Witnessed account. She looked at the satchel. "If anything happens between now and the federal proceedings, that account exists." He nodded slowly. "Rusk's not finished," he said. "I know. He'll regroup in Cedar Hollow. Try the legal angle, first some kind of filing to contest the mineral claim, delay the federal review. Buy himself time." "He won't get it," she said. "Braddock is in the land office. Dane has been building her case for months. The delay tactic only works when the opponent controls the clock." She looked at the fire. "He doesn't control the clock anymore." Bram was quiet for a moment. "He knows that," he said. "That's what scared him in the root cellar. Not the rifle. The clock." She thought about Rusk's face when she'd said Croft's name. The small shift, the first thing she'd said that genuinely surprised him. A man like Rusk survived by knowing what was coming before it arrived, and someone had been moving pieces on the board he hadn't been watching. "My father knew Dane," she said. "There are 3 letters from her in the ledger. He was corresponding with her for over a year." She shook her head slightly. "He built this case in pieces and trusted different people with different pieces, so no single person knowing everything was a vulnerability." "Sounds like a surveyor," Bram said, redundancy. "Yes." She paused. "He trusted you with the most important piece." Bram looked at the fire. "He trusted me with the copies," he said. "He trusted Dane with the political contacts. He trusted the lawyer in Billings with the loan documents. He didn't put everything in one place because he knew one place could be taken," she said. "He designed the whole thing to survive losing any single point." She felt something move in her chest. "He designed it to survive losing himself." The fire crackled. Outside the mountain was its usual January silence. "He was a careful man," Bram said simply. "He was terrified," she said. "He was terrified and he was careful, and he kept working anyway, and that's—" She stopped. "That's what I'll carry, not the anger at Rusk. That." The part where you're scared down to the bone and you keep writing in the ledger. Bram said nothing for a long moment. He'd be proud of you, he said. What you did today. What I did today was improvise badly in a root cellar and get lucky, she said. You named Croft. You named Dane. You named Aldine. You made a man who controls everything through information feel, for the first time, like he was missing something. He looked at her. That wasn't improvisation. That was 2 weeks of knowing exactly what ammunition you were carrying. She looked at him across the room. You're going to need to let someone look at that wound properly, she said. In town, an actual physician. I know, which means going down. Yes. Are you going to be difficult about it? He considered the question with apparent seriousness. Probably. I'll be more difficult, she said. I believe you, he said, and that almost smile appeared, and she turned back to the fire before he could see what was happening in her face. They went down in March, when the lower passes were open enough to ride without the risk that had defined January. Carver went first. Ellis had gotten him stable enough that he could travel 10 days after the confrontation on the mountain, and he rode south, carrying a sworn statement Maribel had written and he had signed, which he delivered personally to Braddock in the Helena land office. Braddock had already received the letters. The federal proceedings were already in motion by the time Maribel and Bram rode into Cedar Hollow on a Thursday morning in early spring, which was how they chose the day deliberately, consciously, because it was a Thursday, and the livestock hall was open on Thursdays for the regular market. And there were people on the street. She wanted people on the street. She wore her own coat this time, the one that fit. She had the satchel across her back. Bram rode beside her on the big dark gelding, and his scar was exactly as visible as it had always been, and he had stopped carrying himself like a man who expected the world to flinch from it, which she wasn't sure he'd noticed, but she had. The street did what streets do when something unexpected rides into them. It stopped, watched, and whispered. She dismounted in front of the land office, the old one, Rusk's instrument, which now had a federal administrator in it named Gaines, who had arrived 3 weeks earlier, and who she had been corresponding with since February. She went inside. What followed took 4 months and was not smooth or fast or satisfying in the clean way that resolution looks in retrospect. The territorial court reviewed the fraudulent instruments, and the process was slow, and the lawyers Rusk hired were competent, and the delay tactics were real. He was not arrested immediately. He was not immediately stripped of everything. The law, as Bram had said, takes time, but takes time in one direction. The Presley grazing rights were returned in April, the Garfield land in May, 2 other properties in June, following a federal ruling on the fraudulent interest instruments that made 3 of Rusk's other notes legally void. Clara Dane published a detailed account in a Helena paper in April that named names and cited documents and was reproduced in 2 other territorial papers within 2 weeks. Sheriff Peck resigned in March, which was not a prosecution, but was something. Aldine testified in May. His documents, combined with the Sutter ledger, and the survey records and Carver's statement, and Dane's collected testimonies, produced a case that the federal prosecutor described, in a letter to Maribel, as the most thoroughly documented land fraud he had encountered in 15 years of territorial practice. Vernon Rusk was arrested in June. Dowd fled the territory. She never learned where he went and spent approximately 3 days thinking about it before deciding it wasn't worth her attention. The mineral claim was formally certified in Maribel Sutter's name in July. She was standing on the porch of the lodge when Bram came up from the barn with the certification document she'd asked him to retrieve from the postwriter, who came through twice monthly. He handed it to her without ceremony, the way he handed her most things directly, no fanfare, as if the object was obviously hers and the transfer was a formality. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it against her chest for a moment, with her eyes closed. Not in prayer, she had no ceremony for what she was feeling, no framework that fit, but just to hold it, to let it be real. Your father filed that claim in November of 1881, Bram said from beside her. 26 years after he came to this territory with $40 and a surveying kit someone had given him as payment for 2 weeks of work. She opened her eyes. How do you know about the $40? He told me. First week we worked together. He said he'd arrived in Montana with $40 and a debt to a man he'd never be able to repay, and that every piece of land he'd ever touched since then was a way of paying it back. She looked at the valley below them. The spring had come to it properly now, the way Montana spring comes, all at once and then immediately committed, the grass coming green along the creek lines and the timber on the higher slopes shaking off the last of the winter brown. The debt, she said. To who? He didn't say, Bram said. I always thought he meant the territory itself, the land. The idea that you take from a place and the accounting never quite closes. He paused. He took the land's secrets and built a life on them. He thought the ledger needed to balance eventually. She thought about her father at his kitchen table, writing in that ledger by lamplight with the particular bent-shouldered posture of a man who has been at a small task for a long time and has decided it matters. He balanced it, she said. Everything he documented every family in that ledger. They got their land back because he wrote it down. Yes, Bram said. He balanced it and didn't live to know it. No, Bram said. He didn't. She held the certification against her chest a moment longer. I'm going to do something with the silver profits, she said. I've been thinking about it since February. I figured you had. The families who lost property, not just the ones in the ledger, others. People who settled claims that Rusk found ways to invalidate before my father started documenting. I want to set up an independent land registry, separate from the territorial office, audited federally. Somewhere people can file claims and have them witnessed by people who don't work for anyone's money. Bram looked at her. That's a significant undertaking, he said. I know, it'll take years, I know that too. You'll need a surveyor, he said, for the technical filings. Someone who knows the land. She looked at him sideways. I happen to know one, she said. He's available, as far as I can tell. He lives on a mountain and doesn't do much. He does quite a lot, Bram said. People just don't see most of it. He could do it somewhere people could see it, she said, if he wanted. He looked out at the valley for a moment. He'd want, Bram said quietly. She nodded. She looked back at the certification in her hands and thought about what her father would say about this specific moment. The one where the thing you worked for and feared you'd never reach is sitting in your hands on a Thursday in July, ordinary as paper, warm from the sun. He would say, write it down. He would say, now what's next? There's something else, Bram said. She looked at him. He was looking at the lake, the one below the lodge, small and cold and very clear, fed by the snowmelt and bordered on the east side by a stand of birch that had gone bright with early leaf. He had the look of a man who has been constructing a sentence for some time and has not yet found one he's satisfied with. You don't have to stay up here, he said. The lodge. The mountain. None of it was a condition of anything. He stopped. Started differently. When I paid those debts in January, I told you it didn't purchase anything. That's still true. The claim is yours. The profits are yours. Cedar Hollow it's changing, but it's going to need someone to live in it and help it change, and that doesn't have to be from up here. She waited. I'm not going to be someone who makes the accounting difficult for you, he said. Whatever you want to do. Wherever you need to go. He stopped again. I'm not the kind of man who holds on to things. She looked at him for a long moment. Bram, she said. Yes. You have said approximately 4,000 words to me about surveying and land law and territorial court procedure, she said, and approximately 11 words about anything that matters to you personally. He looked at the lake. That's probably accurate, he said. So I'm going to say something, and you're going to let me say it without deflecting it into a practical consideration, she said. Can you do that? A pause. I can try, he said. I don't want to go to Cedar Hollow, she said. I want to build the land registry from here, and I want to do the work we talked about, and I want to stay on this mountain. Not because I don't have a choice. I have a very clear choice, which is part of the point, but because the life that's been built here is the life I want. She looked at him directly. And the person I built it with is part of why. He was quiet for a long time. The lake was very still in the afternoon light, and somewhere up the slope, a bird was making a persistent argument with the silence, and the valley below was green in a way that January had made impossible to imagine. I'm not easy to know, he said finally. You've seen most of what there is, and I'm aware it's not an uncomplicated thing. I'm not easy to know either, she said. I'm stubborn and I argue about everything. And I was up until 2 a.m. writing an 11-page account of a root cellar confrontation because I cannot stop documenting things. I know, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. Your father's daughter. Yes, she said. In every way. He turned and looked at her fully. The way he looked at things, he was taking seriously complete attention. Nothing held back for a secondary concern. Then stay, he said. Simply, no architecture around it. I will, she said. And Bram, yes, marry me, she said. He blinked. It was, she noted with private satisfaction, the first time she had genuinely surprised him. He stopped. "I'm asking," she said. "You can say no." "I believe you mentioned something once about that being an option available to people who aren't Rusk." He looked at her for another moment. "Yes," he said. "Yes, you can say no, or yes, he said. "I'll marry you." And the smile arrived this time, fully unhurried. The real thing, different from the almost smiles she'd been cataloging since January. Something that changed the whole geography of his face and made him look like a man who has stopped waiting for something and found it was already here. They married in August, at the lodge, and the families whose land had been restored came up the mountain to bear witness. The Garfields, the Presleys, a handful of others whose names she now knew from the ledger and from months of legal correspondence, but was only now meeting in person. Carver came, walking stiffly but walking. Ellis came, having grown approximately 3 inches since January and having developed the posture of a young man who had decided something about himself on a mountain in winter and was living accordingly. Deeks the trapper came and did not speak at any length to anyone, and ate enough for 2 men and left before dark, which was exactly right. Clara Dane made the trip from Helena and shook Maribel's hand with the firm grip of a woman who has spent years doing necessary work in rooms that didn't want her there. And Maribel felt in that handshake the particular recognition of one such woman for another. Aldine could not travel. His health had not been strong since Oregon, but he sent a letter that Maribel read twice and kept in the satchel beside her father's ledger. There was no perfect moment. The ceremony was short and plainly spoken, and Bram was visibly uncomfortable with being looked at by 40 people simultaneously, which she had anticipated, and which lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and then the practical business of feeding 40 people took over, and the discomfort dissolved into something easier. At some point in the afternoon, she found herself standing at the lake's edge with the water, doing what it always did, holding the mountain's reflection, cold and still and absolutely precise. And she thought about the question of what you owe the place that made you. Her father had arrived in this territory with $40, and a debt he could never name, and he had spent 30 years trying to balance it, and at the end he had left behind a ledger that balanced it for him. She thought about Vernon Rusk, who was in a federal holding facility in Helena waiting for trial, and who would spend the next several years of his life in proceedings that would dismantle everything he'd built, not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through paper, documents, dates and figures and names written down by a man who knew he was running out of time and wrote anyway. She thought about what it means to believe that writing something down matters when you don't know if anyone will read it. That is an act of faith in the future, which is perhaps the most human thing there is. The conviction that the record will outlast the moment, that precision is its own form of hope, that facts carefully documented are a gift to whoever comes next. Bram came and stood beside her at the water. "Carver's looking for you," he said. "He wants to talk about the registry structure." "Of course he does," she said. "He's been thinking about it for 2 months, and he's been polite about waiting until today was over." "He made it 40 minutes past the ceremony," Bram said. "That's restraint." She looked at the lake. "In Cedar Hollow," she said, "they're still telling the story. I heard from Gaines last month people talk about the livestock haul. The man who walked in with a bag of gold and said he'd take her." "I know," he said. "They think it was a rescue," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Let them," he said. "I don't want to let them," she said, "because the story they're telling is wrong, and the wrong story teaches the wrong thing." She turned to look at him. "You didn't rescue me. You gave me room to stand up. Those are entirely different actions." He looked at her. "What does the right story teach?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "That the most dangerous thing you can do to someone like Rusk isn't to fight him," she said. "It's to document him. Carefully, patiently, with copies in 4 locations," she paused. "And that you don't have to be untouchable to do it. My father was scared. I was scared. You were sitting alone on a mountain for 6 years, which is its own kind of scared. None of us was certain. We just kept working." He looked at the lake for a moment. "Your father knew that," he said. "He did," she said. He wrote it down. Behind them the gathering was still going, voices, movement, the particular warmth of people who have come through something hard and are sitting together on the other side of it, not unmarked by what happened, not pretending the winter hadn't cost anything. But here, on a mountain in August, in the late light, with the valley green below them and the work already begun. Bram put his hand in hers. Not a gesture of protection or possession. Just the ordinary contact of two people who have chosen each other and are standing at the same lake, looking at the same mountain, and finding, against reasonable expectation, that the view from here is enough. The West shocked when I said I'd take her, he said quietly. The whole territory, yes, she said. They still think that's the story. She looked at their hands. His large, scarred, the hands of a man who had built things alone and had learned slowly to build with someone. Hers ink-stained at the fingertips, a fading bruise still visible at the wrist from Dowd's grip. Her father's stubborn competence in the knuckles. It wasn't, she said. You never took me anywhere. No, he said, I didn't. We went, she said. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and outside the window of any simple telling of this story. The truth was exactly that plain and exactly that hard won. Not a rescue, not a transaction, not a man saving a woman or a woman saving a man, but two people who had both been diminished by the world's particular cruelties, and who had found, in the work of standing together against one specific injustice, that they were less diminished than they'd thought. That is the thing about choosing someone in full knowledge of what they cost and what they carry. It is not romantic in the easy sense. It is not seamless. It is the daily decision to keep showing up to the table where the maps are spread out, and the problems are real, and the solutions require more patience than inspiration. Maribel Sutter had learned that from her father, who had written it down in a water-damaged ledger by lamplight, because he believed the record mattered even when he couldn't see who would read it. She squeezed Bram's hand once. Carver's waiting, she said. He is, Bram agreed. They turned from the lake and walked back toward the gathering, toward the work, toward the long, patient business of building something that would last. Not because it was perfect, but because enough people had decided it was worth the trouble. And that, in the end, is the only foundation anything real has ever been built on.